All right, so you should be able to see my entire desktop here. I did that because it's possible I might click a link and need to go to a different page. Reminder that there is a film tonight on the third floor in North Corman, 3226, which is just down the hall, probably halfway or close to the bathrooms on the third floor. It is a part of the Climate Emergency Spring into Action University series, but it is being hosted by the Interior Design Student Organization and the IAD program. But it does pertain to really all design because it's focused on blue, well, it's called blue vinyl, but it's really just focused on vinyl materiality, material applications, health, safety, and wellness in manufacturing processes, globalization, mass consumerism, all of that really good stuff that goes into design. So that is from 7 to 9 tonight. And then the movie is about an hour and 40. So with the remaining 20 minutes, we'll have a short discussion panel. One of the panelists is faculty Emily Tim. I think some of you might have her as an instructor right now. She's got material expertise. And then we will have some student panelists talking about the use of vinyl in their work, in their learning, their thoughts since this movie came out 20 years ago, and comparing it to the industry now. So if that at all interests you, if you're interested in sustainability, urge you to check that out. Also, if you are interested in sustainability, you may have already heard, but January, Gensler, maybe I still even have it up. Gensler launched, we do have it up, their product sustainability standards. So that went live this month in and of itself. And it's a sort of a rating system or basically standards relating to these specific products. So if you're interested in products that are, applications within the built environment and sustainability and kind of those overarching things, or if they relate to any projects that you have, these standards relate specifically to product design. And Gensler is a global, like a huge global design firm, integrated design firm, researchers as well. I would say they're very much starchitects. So holding themselves to these standards, they're setting a tone for the rest of the design community to really only specify and work with products that meet these standards. It'll be interesting to see. I also just saw, and it'll probably come up tonight, but engineered stone as an entire product is now been just in December completely banned in Australia. So engineered stone would be any type of artificial, like marble, granite, not original, but the man-made versions, but also quartz and other stones that are human-made. Now banned because of the silica dust is killing people within a couple years of the manufacturing process. So they saw a huge epidemic in people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s passing away after working, like cutting countertops, like working in shops. So that's a lot of industrial designers, product designers, tradespersons that were dying because we specify these materials in our projects. California has introduced policy to ban engineered stone, and I imagine that within the next 10 years, the many other countries around the world and some other states will be on board with that as well. So it's kind of interesting if that is at all something you're interested in. Blue vinyl has a very similar story with how many people it kills and affects in the manufacturing process, but it the industry is so profitable in the US. The manufacturing is largely headquartered in China in the US, that it is going to be quite the fight to break into that industry. So I commend Australia for saying that they value the health and wellness of people over whatever economic gains that they could have gotten from that. So, question, does the banning of man-made stone affect the jewelry industry as well? Yeah, so in Australia, um, any engineered stone is not allowed. I'm sure people in Australia could order it from somewhere else and have it imported, which is probably what's going to happen. But yeah, any manufacturing form of it, it's a move to clean up the air, but it's probably far less negative on a smaller scale. But yeah, great question. And also it's so new. I mean, it has only been in effect for a month. I think December 23 was when it went in effect. So it's still very new. There might be a phase out. So no new products, like phasing out some of those industries. All right. Let me go back to our PDF. For those who wanted connections to the architects or designers for your projects, I did reach out and I am waiting to hear back. So the update on that is that no word yet. But if you know the companies too, I also urge you to reach out directly. Ooh, I'm giving away our today's scandal already. Let me move it. All right, so I will go over a scandal today, but it will be in the middle of our presentation. When we go over technology, terminology, and architectural style, it is going to provide some information that might inspire specific perspectives as you are still embarking on your explorations of, architectural story making or actually, that just reminded me, one of you, I don't have the list offhand, but whoever has Heritage Hall, I just learned that the original architect was never credited. And in fact, the architect that is credited to that building is not the original. The original architect was, in fact, a Black architect and never received credit. So there is a woman who knows the true history and why this happened, how this happened, of Heritage Hall. I did get her information. So I will look up whoever has Heritage Hall, because one thing with the app that we're hoping to do is take inventory of as many projects as we can in Southwest Michigan that were designed by Black architects and launch those projects to the app first in February. And then the same thing in March with any buildings that have any females in their history, and kind of launch those. I do understand that your projects won't be finished. I have Heritage Hall. Okay, cool. Billy, I will get with you to get you the information of the woman who knows the more explicit history of Heritage Hall. And this is a great example of how not always the actual stories are documented, and that it's important to get facts straight. I also learned, I know nobody has the Waldo Library, which in the future I'm going to have that be featured, because I did learn from the librarian, because I've been working on getting an architectural tour scheduled there. The library was designed after neo-Nazi architectural styles. And it's not something they want to advertise, but as keeper of the app, we are going to write about that and publish that. And that's an important part of history. So I had no idea. I don't really interact with the Waldo Library that much. I go there sometimes for projects. But we might have the opportunity to tour and see some of these specific things, and how it used to work. But I think that's a side tangent. All right. So just as a recap, last week we talked about the Gruen effect. Victor Gruen, Austrian architect, came to the US, invented the malls, watched consumerism culture take off and urban sprawl happen as a result, and moved back to Europe with his tail between his legs with shame. We also talked about ancient civilizations and what technological thinking is, and some of the things that go into the creation of vernacular. We talked about things that also like cultural, social, survival things that create vernacular. So it's very much aligned with form follows function. And I think we left off on this slide. So I'll start here. We talked about how once people, designers learned how to structurally span things and turn corners. Structurally, how to support these more complex and larger structures. We saw civilization take off because now you can have, instead of having a single building with space for only a family, now you can start designing significantly larger structures, which means religious ceremonies can happen, burial grounds, a lot of different things, communal living. It means that you can start creating different types of public structures. So we saw everything from huge buildings for tombs. We saw things that were designed to represent religious practices, so different shapes of buildings now that weren't necessarily because of a functional reason, but because of a spiritual or a social or a cultural reason. A good example, when we think of the pyramids in Egypt, we think, of a pitch. And pitches are a really efficient structure, especially in areas that receive a lot of snow, which is why in Michigan and places that receive a lot of snow, you see pitched roofs as the most common roof type. But that's not the case in Egypt. So we start seeing these structures that almost don't correlate directly with survival needs. They're responding to something more abstract, a higher social, cultural need. So as we talk about structure, the creation, so I mean, when we look at this, you can see columns and lintels right here. There is a difference. So you have columns, and then you have beams, which provide the structure across the columns. Lintels are the things that allow unstructured openings. So like doors. So you have a lintel. Once culture, society started designing that, where you could have an opening and have it supported, a lot of interesting things started happening. So we have Stonehenge up top. Underneath it, we have the Kimball Art Museum. Has anybody been to the Kimball Art Museum? It's one of the most beautiful museum experiences you'll ever have. It has a fantastic like shadow and light experience because fine art really can't be touched by the sun without deteriorating it. So museums have to really navigate how do you get that nice natural light in without sacrificing the artwork that's on display. And it does take some creativity, and the Kimball Art Museum by far has really basic structure. I mean, we're seeing almost the exact same thing as Stonehenge right here. And you can see how they're spanning space. Museums also generally have larger openings of spaces for galleries. But the roof treatment and the allowance of light coming through indirectly is very unique to this specific museum. So if you're ever in Fort Worth, check out this museum. They always have really great exhibitions, and the architecture is world class. I actually have an image of it being constructed, or at least the renovation of it. And you can see how we have contemporary construction equipment, lifting and putting things into place. But when we think about Stonehenge, those are we would need heavy duty construction equipment to lift stones like that, very monolithic, very heavy. And also these stones are not super native to that region. They were transported, I believe, from Wales, I want to say. I wonder if I think I have it written down somewhere, but yeah. Um, so how do you get that? How do you transport this type of material? Up until the 14th century, many people believed in the mythology behind it, that Merlin the wizard constructed Stonehenge. There's still a lot of theories. It still is kind of a physics dream to find all the ways that people could have transported, excavated, um, you know, these exact stones and the dimensions of them, transported them, cut them, and situated them. There are a lot of ways to really break it down. But what it seems to be the consensus is this is an image just to represent what may have happened is the use of trees and pulley systems. So not unlike very, very early, primitive technological thinking, it's the exact same ideas of how we move things today. We just have um, different materials. So now we have steel, and we have different ways of lifting things that takes the burden off of a huge team of laborers. And then there's also speculations of how these were floated down the river or down, through water, using the ideas of like salt and buoyancy and different types of rafts and balance. So it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down, but the large consensus is that it was built like this, and over time, we didn't really evolve that idea. We just innovated the technology, and it really did make me think of the conversation we had about Tetris on Tuesday, where Michael Quaggi mentioned that a lot of the innovations in video games, Tetris, happens because people start using the controllers in different ways, usually inspired because they have some kind of disability that requires them to do that just to play the game. And thus it innovates their methods of doing. But they're still playing the game using the same controller. They're just doing it a little differently. This is the same thing. So the technological thinking part has not evolved. We haven't thought of a new way of doing it. We're doing it the same way. We just have different equipment. So if we're thinking about the post and lintel system, let's see, Stonehenge had a few restorations done in the early 1900s and 50s to make it look like how it does today. There are photographs. Yeah, I mean, it's a national treasure. It's global treasure, so it is upkept. And anytime you have an ancient site that is open to the public, and extremely exposed to the forces of climate, it does require continuous renovations. But the true innovation is that it had two verticals and a horizontal that spanned it, and it stood up. I know that seems really basic, but it was a huge leap for humankind in how we can then progress civilizations. What you're looking at here, I mean, this is super contemporary. It's a historic building, but it's contemporary. And we're starting to see more architectural styles and details to it, but at its core, it is still inspired by the post and lentil system. But now we can start doing more unique things like arches. We can start thinking of smaller modular units of stone. And of course, how we're decorating it. But the keystone and all of the other decorative aspects to it, it's still an opening. It's still based on verticals and a need to span the horizontal without anything under it. And so we're still, I mean, that is still generally how we have our openings today. We just have different materials and capabilities to do it. Other things, so we had a basic post and lentil opening, and then we started to be able to do arches, as you can kind of see here. But then once we got that expertise of that arch, now this is where innovation starts taking place. We're starting to do something different with it, not just hold up structure or span. We're actually starting to use it in a different way. So the technology of the arch can be used if you submerge it in the ground. And so now these are just two examples. So you have functional engineering. They were mainly used for burial. But they were used by various cultures who had no communication with each other. So we start seeing cultures over time, no communications, evolving at the same rate, spanning space, making corners, and then starting to add more details, whether it was for just aesthetic purposes, whether it was a craft, whatever it was. Now we can start thinking about infrastructure. So this allows, I mean, think of all the infrastructure where you see this, drainage, flowing water. Now we're starting to think about transportation of things. We're creating routes. And now we don't even need them. So you can see in this image, at this point, the structure of the building that we're looking at here is on the interior. What we're looking at here is decorative. It's no longer needed. It's a signifier. It's meant to establish dominance. It's meant to establish hierarchy and prominence. And we see this a lot with civil buildings. So in any brands where you want to establish a sense of trust or authority, you kind of play off of things that are all people already associate with those qualities. And so now we have pulling on these things for just pure decoration. But it also means that no longer are we having a flat surface. It is almost extruding from the building and it's creating a nook. That is also something that is not always needed. There are some areas in the world where that's a very effective way of having an opening that controls sun and wind, such as in India, for instance. There's a lot of different angles for openings to provide a really nice cooling and protect from harsh sun. But in this location in the UK, that's not necessarily needed. What is nice, I mean, if you have rain or snow, sometimes being able to bump out the exterior shell from the interior allows a shedding. And so it does preserve some of the interior materials because it's protecting that a little bit. But primarily it's decorative. I mean, they could have done that and had this be solid. They didn't need to put figures in here or kind of like these pillars or any of these decals. It's 100% for aesthetic decoration. So now we can start thinking about architecture versus shelter because we've, in history, mastered survival. If we're coming up with civil infrastructure, and now we can find ways to clear wastewater from where we live. We can push it down a mountain, push it down a hill. We can irrigate. We can support our agriculture and livestock. So the health and wellness of people is going up. The sophistication is also increasing in civilization. And so the survival is not a huge deal anymore. It's thriving. And so architecture became more of a discipline. And when I say architecture, I am talking about all of design and actually philosophy as well, because design embodies philosophies and personal values, especially in a historical context, where philosophy was truly a dominating study in design schools, which we'll look at on Tuesday when we talk about Aztec culture and Egyptian culture. Even though you see this throughout all times and all cultures where people are starting to thrive, or survival of the fittest has already happened. So people can engage in philosophy and religion. People can go into expert professions. People can travel. So now we have dissemination of ideas and more materials happening. And so architecture surpasses structure and shelter. And now it doesn't always need to exist. It's sometimes you create for the sake of creating, even though you don't need it. Or maybe you're creating exterior spaces like gardens, promenades, all of these things to help distinguish a space. That was not needed before, but it is something that can happen. So let me see. Okay. A few things. We are still interested in durability as it pertains to strength and safety. We're still interested in function. Form follows function. I'm actually going to show you in a minute here a few examples of what happens when form doesn't follow function, which is the furthest from vernacular you can get. And then aesthetics. We can focus just on aesthetics if we really, really wanted to. So why would we want to focus on something like aesthetics? Well, throughout time, architecture has been used as a source of power to reinforce hierarchy, whether it's a religious building that is substantially larger and more intricate. It is showing that the religion is the dominant governance. It could allow a social hierarchy of arrangement of dwellings and spaces. In fact, and this maybe will be something we talk about later in the class, Hitler used architecture and design a lot in World War II to control a narrative, to reinforce political ideals. And that was all about branding. So a typeface was created or co-opted just to represent those ideals, specific architectural features, just to represent those ideals. And then a custom design team was created to go around and have you seen his crazy megastructure concepts for New Berlin? Scary. Good point. Yes. Also, Hitler is one of the first times that we have documented the use of design to hide things, to hide qualities about ourselves that we didn't want society to understand. So Hitler designed architecture. How do I say this? So he could hide love affairs, same-sex love affairs. And now we have an entire discipline in design called queer space, because it allowed people to really understand how space was used, intentionally designed to hide different types of sexualities and identities, without people even realizing it. It was sort of like an optical illusion where you have attention over here, but you're hiding and veiling something over here. And so he was able to use style and architecture to distract, and had structures specifically designed so he could have personal affairs without the guise of anybody noticing. There are books on this. And since then, there are many books specifically on the use of space for power and pleasure, and identity for a lot of different demographics of people. Queer space is a really up and coming, newer kind of conversation and discourse, and more books are being published every single day about it. But you can also look at race, class, gender, a lot of different things. Photographic example. I will do, when we talk about World War II and more of that, we'll get into it. But I do have a book called Hitler at Home, which goes into detail about that too. Okay. So there's this clash between, we want to develop, we want to be global, we want to be international, we want to be sophisticated and thrive, but there are some basic constraints that we do still need to satisfy to survive. We do still have to exist within some kind of climate. We're always going to have the environmental factors affecting where we exist. So that could be weather, it could be the topography, it could be anything. These are some examples of some climates. In design, at least in architecture and like urban planning and large scale master planning, the climate becomes extremely important. So understanding what climate you live in or what climate you're designing in is very, very important. And here are some examples. For anybody that has been to London, you might be aware of the Walkie-Talkie building. If you're not, here is a picture of it. Right here, you can see this guy is looking up at it. So this is an example of when form does not follow function. So the building was designed to be it's a skyscraper, but it was designed to be very out of context. It looks like, so let's see if I have another picture of it. This is it. Very, very different. And even just solid rectangles are sort of different. But the issue, so burned holes in cars. It did. And one of the reasons this building was allowed to be built, because of course people were protesting the design of it, was they were like, we're gonna use some of the site to provide public parks. So we're gonna give back. And that's often how buildings get built and get through cities, is because you make something accessible or public. We see that in Milwaukee with allowing the waterfront to be public. So they were like, here, we're going to give you some park space and we'll maintain it. Well, the park ended up like catching fire and burning people and giving them skin cancer and being really problematic. And of course, yes, in the buildings around it, it burned holes in cars, it ruined infrastructure, it set fire in other buildings because it magnified through their windows. Very, very problematic. And there's really logistical reasons why it's not, it's pretty basic physics. When we talk about structure, I almost wonder if the architect didn't like ever have a magnifying glass when they were little and like go outside and try to like set brush on fire or something, because that's essentially what this is. So there are parts of the day, London has had to take like government policy control of this. There are parts of the day where various areas around London are not accessible because they're being impacted by these deadly rays. Let me see. Yeah, one journalist fried an egg. So this is the architect who now says we made a lot of mistakes with this building and didn't realize it was going to be so hot. So that's what happens when you don't really understand the climate and the angle of the sun as it would hit a building at a specific time of day. So these are just some photos. You can see like it is a spotlight. And so there are, as it's funny because we learn a lot about the circadian rhythm and the angles of the sun, because the London has actually had to follow the movement that the light of the sun is taking throughout the day and block it off. So at certain parts, like these areas are not allowed. They're blocked off. Of course, it's public. People are going to walk, people are going to do whatever, but there's no parking, there's no deliveries, there's no business. And it's short. So if it affects your neighborhood, it's going to be for 2 hours at a time. But still, this does happen. And we still don't necessarily learn from it. If you are going to London ever, I put a little map just in case, so you know exactly where it's located, or if you're familiar with London and want to know, it's this little dot right here. How long do you estimate this building will exist? Didn't know the full extent of it. Oh, it's going to be there for a while. I mean, they knew that this was already happening when it was under construction and it was still allowed to finish. It's already been 10 years, I want to say, since this building's existed. So the only thing that they're doing right now is mitigating. It's been on the responsibility of the city to control what's open around it, and then the buildings like next to it that get some of the angle coming in, they've had to make changes in their specific spaces. It's not the death ray yes. So actually, here is the death ray. If anybody's been to Vegas, there is a Death Ray Hotel. This is also a newer building that was built, and they also provide public pool. Even though it's a hotel, they said we're going to provide this pool and guests can use it, but so can a lot of other people. And they made this really prominent area. You can see the design here. This wasn't their diagram. What happened is that the water boiled and they made some human tortellinis. So anytime it feels like the buildings are forced to give back space, they're gonna like set it on fire. This building still exists. Employees hate it. They close the pool during specific times because the water gets so hot. Yeah, so it's there. It just exists and we just have to know about it. It always is really, really large buildings as well. But again, Las Vegas, we understand the climate there. We understand what's going on. So you can see in the context of these images that there's different materialities and forms and massings of buildings. And this one is designed to stand out. And that's usually people's intention, is designed to stand out. But that can be difficult because as a result, you're kind of defying vernacular and like basic survival needs. Versus some examples of things that exist simply because of the need to survive. So in tropical areas, and these are contemporary photos. Tropical areas, buildings often employ walls or roofs made of vegetative material that can breathe. And then snow is an excellent insulator. So the Swiss roofs will often have, and this is like a really easy way, but really sophisticated buildings, you'll start seeing Swiss roofs, their roofing materials have this construction. So it's designed to prevent the snow from coming off. The buildings are structurally built to withstand the weight of the snow, unlike our buildings here where we like to shed the snow off of our roofs. We have we put on our heat, we blast our heat. So insulating our homes and our buildings is not always a priority of us because we can artificially take care of that. But in other areas where they want to be more sustainable or passive, or they don't have climate control to that same extent, you have to figure out ways to stay comfortable. And this is one of them, is retain the snow for the roof, and it will provide a natural insulation because it heats it up. Heat rises and escapes to cold. So if we can make the roof thick with insulation and there's less of a contrast of where hot is meeting cold, it's going to keep the heat inside for longer. So even though this is a really basic idea of like, yeah, okay, we can do that. Defying this can result in some pretty poor decisions. And we do see buildings being torn down because they're not performing well. Has anybody been to Falling Water? The Frank Lloyd Wright house in Falling Water. It's a museum now, but it's not performative, I would say. It's very leaky. Okay, so you will have readings in this class. You probably are wondering why you're taking a history class that doesn't have a substantial textbook and you're not getting like reading and writing assignments. It is because, and this is from one of these history books that is pretty basic for design history, but you can really start questioning the writing and the perspective of the writers and what they're coming from. So in red is me, it's actually me responding to some things that textbooks say. One thing they said is that interior design enhances the qualities of the interiors to improve the function of the spaces and to treat interior areas in an aesthetically pleasing manner. While that's not false information, it's not completely accurate. It's not the history of interior design. And then they also say until the 20th century, interiors were usually completed by building architects and as such complemented by the structure. So we've been talking about vernacular and like think about these aren't the homes that are being documented or the buildings that are being documented in history books where you name the architects and the designers and that information, whereas larger projects like this, maybe these impressive buildings you might learn more about. But this is often seen as a different class of architecture, when in fact, most of those buildings were designed and built historically by women. Oh, comment in the chat, all the Frank Lloyd Wright houses seem like they were designed without functional longevity and durability in mind. The one-off stadium has annual water damage because the downspouts are built into the roof overhangs, and in the winter, the ice expands and cracks the pipes. Yes. Yeah, and Frank Lloyd Wright is intentionally, he wasn't trying to not do that. He actually believed in form over function, in that it was an expression of art, his artistic creation, and we preserve them. So normally things that are like that would get torn down and would have lost and moved on. But we've decided to preserve these. We toured, I don't think anybody in this call was there, but last semester in this class, we went to Detroit and we toured oh shoot, why am I forgetting the name of the house? In Bloomfield. It was really beautiful. And there were some really inspirational cooling mechanisms, like an internal cooling well. So there was like a water pool built under the house, and the wind and air would blow through it, and water cools air, and then it would blow up into the house's mechanical areas. So in a way, that's pretty cool. But yeah, the same exact treatment to the water dispersal of the runoff was done, and they've had to redesign that and actually expand the water downspouts way past the building. The one-off stadium has a water reserve under the concrete slab for heated hallways and floors. Yeah, exactly. Turkey House is, okay. All right. Okay, so ornamentation, and I have a few slides here and information that I'm actually really curious to get your opinion on as product designers, because I'm not 100%, I'm still learning your curriculum, and what you may or may not know in terms of the history of like furniture making and like material applications that go beyond like manufacturing and engineering. So we'll talk about ornamentation because this does kind of go into that. So ornamentation is just anything that you add to something. You don't necessarily need it. That's in a nutshell. That's really, really all that it is. It exists for political reasons, cultural, economic, religious, an assortment, just people's preferences. And there's nothing wrong with it. There's a lot of discourse and opinions about it, but it is not doing you can still have a vernacular performative design and still have it ornamented. So this is still serving its purpose of providing seating. There are different ways of creating colors and patterns. So we have a term called whitewashing, this is also from the book. So a lot of books are still using outdated terms. And whitewashing is still very prevalent as a term on social media, and people don't realize they're using it. There's a lot of influencers that are specific to like DIY design, and they give you tips and tricks on like how to whitewash a room or like whitewash the bricks. So that term, it does describe what you're actually doing to a material. That is the result, is that it lightens it. But the term itself does refer to breeding and society and race. And it was adopted because that's very similar to when we whitewash a surface. We're kind of taking away some of the color, ornamentation, and detail. So the chemical used to achieve that result is a lime wash paint. So you might hear either term. It's kind of on the cusp, like depending on somebody's education level, because whitewashing is the mainstream term that people use, and it is still in many magazines and books. But as professional designers, it's better to just be more specific because we focus more on the process of using lime. Yeah, HT. Yeah, uses lime washing. Good. I'm glad to hear it. That's new. There's lacquering. So have you had a class where you went through all the different kind of ornamentation styles and making styles and furniture? Never. Okay. Even while I was putting this together, thought of a really cool assignment idea for future classes that I would love to get people's opinion on. Because we may use these terms, and you may use these terms in assignments throughout the semester. Lacquering is a technique rooted in Chinese culture that is actually, lacquer is the sap of a tree indigenous to China. Now lacquer has different like contemporary, like if you went to Home Depot and got lacquer, it's not going to be the authentic. It's sort of like champagne. If you've ever heard the champagne argument, like if it's not from France, it's not champagne. If it's not from the Champagne region in France, it's like sparkling wine. Very similar. Lacquer technically is it is a very specific chemical process, and it requires ingredients native to China to do. It's not harmful. Okay, caves to cathedrals use these terms a lot. Okay, good to know. But did you go into the history of them and like the how, I would say, like how to do it? I know I have a history degree, an art history degree, and when I learned stuff like this, I learned my history classes were studios. So we would learn by doing. So we would actually build furniture and like gild and do all of these stuffs ourselves and learn about the classical processes, which I think could be really cool to do sometimes. Briefly, they talked about how large components were moved, but not much more than that. Large components like Stonehenge, I'm assuming, or yep. Thank you for participating in the chat. This is great. Columns and pillars. Yeah. So Japanning. It's an imitation of lacquering technique used in Europe. So if you're familiar with why Native Americans are called Indians, then you might be able to easily understand why Europeans would call lacquering Japanning and get a mix up there. That's essentially it. Lacquer, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But Japanning is an imitation anyway, so it is not authentic lacquering. It's like a ripoff, but alcohol-based shellac, that's what you would find at Home Depot. Oh, shellac, with black or red color added. I'd rather have tree sap, to be honest. But we have veneering, which is a thin sheet of rare or expensive materials laminated to a less expensive material. Usually when we think of veneer, we often think of the actual wood, like a wood veneer, but a veneer could be anything that is just a teeny tiny little finish to it, usually to make something feel more expensive, because it would be very expensive to have an entire table made out of an exotic wood, than to just have it made out of maybe a native wood and then put a nice veneer on it. Expensive and ethically questionable, I will say. And then we have gilding, which is the application of a thin sheet of gold to a surface. This can be put on anything. Here are some examples. So the assignment concept I have, I don't think we'd be able to pull it off this semester because it will require a lot more pre-planning, is to actually have like a day where we bring in gold leaf and we gild things. And I'll bring in like the actual brushes that you would use, and are like veneers. You can actually learn about how to shape and apply a veneer. I will try to track down we'll get both authentic and imitation lacquering, but it could be fun to just do this, just have a day where we're doing this kind of stuff. Also, like carving, so changes in surface depth. So there's a lot of different ways, like whether you're we talk about this in 2D a lot, whether you're removing or adding, or in paint we do talk about, like, you remove paint to create an image, or you add it. It's the same thing with kind of carving of wood. So we have appliques, which you create separate and then you attach to something to make it look like it was carved into it, but it was just an add-on. This became really popular when it was just, you wanted this higher end feel and this decoration, ornamentation, but the process of like this incised carving or this scratch carving, it's really involved and it's really expensive, and it often means that only some people can have it, you know, if they want to ornament their houses or furniture, whatever, with this. Versus applique, you can have an artist still create smaller pieces and then you can apply it to anything. You can go to Hobby Lobby and look, and they have a whole aisle of just these things that you could get and bring home and like put on your mantle or your bookshelf, like glue it. And in fact, a lot of fine furniture today that you would think like a baker, if you look at it and you're looking at like a Baker buffet, like a Baker, the company, and it's got like nice carvings in it, and it has three-dimensional qualities to it. Those are appliques. They're really well done and they're done by artisans, but because they mass produce their furniture, it's really hard to get this hand touch to it. So if you ever find anything where it's clearly handmade like this, it's a gem. It's really fun to do though. If anybody hasn't done that, we could learn about scratch. So scratch is the removing. You actually scratch the voids out, and that's why you can see this texture Incise is where you're taking like a very specific, yeah, when I refinish old furniture, I snap the appliques off. Yeah, and a lot of times people do add them. So it's good that they are removable in that way. So changes in surface depth, there's other things that we can do. So there's different types of sacrilege. There's different types of carving. There's molding, there's piercing, there's turning. They're all different types. And I'm not sure if because these are like manufacturing, making types. Do you do this in like the shop downstairs for your projects? Like just learning the art of these things, let me know. Because that could be something cool that we do. It doesn't have to be large scale. It could be small scale. So this is the back of a hairbrush. Could be jewelry, it could be a pin, it could even be clothing. It could be a hairpiece. So there's a lot of different ways that you can still have nice quality artisanal made things at different scales. There's the application of motifs. Motifs become really, really important throughout all of time. They will be important when you are assigned your ancient design in the contemporary world because our world is full of motifs. They're essentially a pattern. They're a way to create orderly arrangement. They could be natural. So like we'll talk about the Minoan culture, but it was a culture that was really rooted in like sea life, marine life, a lot of seafood, a lot of not very like very gentle, happy people. They weren't like didn't have a huge like military or anything. They were just kind of like your like happy beach people. So they have you've probably seen these really nice clay vases with like octopuses, I forget what it is, on them, or like marine life. That is a Minoan motif, and those represent things. And so all these motifs represent ideals, just like we were talking about how if you want to establish a representation or identity, we actually look to things that have successfully done that and try to align ourselves with that. It's a brand strategy. It's why a lot of companies will put Rosie the Riveter as a part of their logo because they want to seem industrious and like gritty. So Rosie the Riveter in essence becomes a bit of a motif. So even like very basic shapes and symbols can be arranged to create patterns and ornamentation that represent values and ideals. You can clearly look at something and start to derive its origin, its time period, maybe the way that it was made, just by the use of motif and some small expressions here. We have circles and curves, mechanical curves, semicircular arches, spirals, everything eventually is some kind of motif. Spirals even are a motif. Even when we think about the golden ratio, really hoping everybody has a good handle on the golden ratio or like the idea of this like perfect proportion and equation. It happens in nature quite a bit, but we can see it. So even buildings that look like they might not be overly motif, what we're looking at here is the interior of a building that was designed for a client who was a composer of classical music and really appreciated classical architecture and modern architecture, and ultimately wanted a villa where he could bring groups of people and listen to classical music together. So it became a residential venue to listen to music, but wanted to stay as classical as possible. So that generally means like, let's look for those classical motifs in the circles, the spirals, the golden ratio. This is a big central earth that we're seeing here. And just as an experiment, I overlaid the golden ratio, spiral, Fibonacci sequence, whatever, a lot of different ways of calling it. I like to disassociate it with Fibonacci since it did exist before a person with the name of Fibonacci like documented it. We look at that, don't worry, we will come back to that. Especially it is actually the first documented golden ratio was documented by the ancient Egyptians. But if we overlay those proportions here, you can see that it actually fits perfectly. So the biggest spiral here starts at the top. I don't know if it's a little cut off there. Grazes the edge, grazes the bottom, grazes the other edge, and comes in and then continues the spiral. When it comes in, it actually grazes the top of the opening of the actual fire, and continues in. And then when we look at that first arc right here where my cursor is, if we were to create a line, because you can also create the golden proportions by, instead of using a spiral, actually just taking the proportions and going down. So we have one rectangle. The first rectangular cut is nearly aligned with the shelf that is in this firewood nook. So without the spiral here, it kind of looks like there's just this like really big fireplace and this kind of like rectangular firewood opening and shelf, and it doesn't look like there was any other logic applied to this other than what maybe looks good or like what's a good arm length to grab firewood and put it in the fire. But it is based on this math. In fact, even the method that the stone was, this is rammed earth, even the even the proportion the rammed earth was created in, the layers. So it cures and then you put more in and then it cures. It creates a pattern that also aligns with these rectangles. And you can see that this cuts through the actual fireplace, or the opening to the fire right down the middle. So it's really, really fascinating. You can begin to break this down even more based on classical proportions and mathematics and understanding of acoustics and how sound bounces off of space. And if you were to let that dictate angles and directions, the entire house is designed for that. But it doesn't come off like a theater or a Renaissance building of some kind. It's definitely like a cool, earthy, modern place to be. We have other types of motifs too. Doesn't have to just be like shapes and spirals. We can have crosses. So this is the origin of what we understand as a swastika, but this you can see down here is all the derivations of it and how then this is exactly the point of taking something tried and true, accepted by many societies, already ingrained in like patterns of life and ideals, co-opt it into a logo that is identifiable. And unfortunately now people are, hesitant to use this shape because of, rightly so, because of its associations now. But every single culture has some form of this. And even when you look at simple tile patterns on the floor, they don't always come across like this, but you will start to notice arrangements that when you break down a modular unit of them, you can actually pull out images or shapes that look just like this because they fit together. They're repeatable patterns that easily fit together. They're just disguised. We have stars, naturalistic design, so a sphinx, for instance, and of course, abstract forms as well. Here, you'll see a lot of band patterns. So in the fall, this class usually runs in the fall, and I take the class on a haunted architectural walking tour of downtown on the Friday before Halloween. And it's actually led by architectural historians who are certified priests, and specifically like the priests that dabble in like seance and demonology is the certification that they hold. So and of course they dress up like Civil War ghosts to lead so it's fun. It's definitely an entertaining thing. We don't have to do that around Halloween time, but we could maybe think about doing it closer to when the spring is nicer, because they do point out different architectural patterns and why they're there and what they were meant for and how they were used. They're really great at pointing out the social aspects behind them. So the stories that happened in their midst, and how like they'll point out things like these on buildings that are like haunted objects. So like for instance, the cannon downtown in oh God, what's the name of that park? The big park that has the cannon. That cannon apparently is haunted. Not the space, yeah, Bronson Park, thank you. Not the space, but the actual object. So they really focus on the haunting of objects and the transfer of spirit within objects. It's just a fun, thing that we can do. But if you're interested in that, and the weather is nicer towards the end of the semester, maybe that's something we can do. But I don't know, maybe if it's not Halloween, it's not too relevant. We can take motifs and create larger patterns. So we have what's called a diaper pattern, a counter change pattern, and a panel pattern. And yes, a diaper pattern, the diaper, the design of the diaper that we put on humans of all sizes, shapes, and ages, but yes, like a baby diaper, is the pattern. It essentially is based on a true diaper pattern, because it is a motif that covers the entire part of a surface. Sometimes motifs just cover partial surfaces, but a diaper that will like the motif and the pattern, it will turn contours, it will span the entire thing, and it sometimes is a one-off. So because it's designed for that specific site, the motif is specifically designed for that area that it has to cover. We have counter change patterns, which two alternating colors and textures of the same shapes. And we have panel patterns, which are discontinuous. They don't repeat. So basically, we have just looked at different design ideas, from shelter and survival to how the post and lintel system was a technology that made us be able to evolve past our bare minimum need for survival and start to ornament our lives and distinguish our lives and our buildings for better or worse. We don't always have to design rooted in vernacular, because we do have artificial systems to heat and cool our houses. So we don't always need to have natural ways of, passive ventilation and cooling. That may or may not be a good thing. We probably don't intend to boil people while they swim, but that can happen if we forget about basic principles of vernacular, the climate that we're working in, the site, and the even properties of material and basic physics and shapes. All right, so that is all I have for you today. Or on Tuesday, again, we will talk about ancient Egypt. What was it like to be a student in ancient Egypt? What kind of things would you study? What would your curriculum be? What are some things you would study? What are some of those assignments? What were they looking like? We'll also talk about design in ancient Egypt, and we'll also compare it to then around on the other side of the world, Aztec culture, so Middle America. So never came into contact with one another, and we can compare how, students were raised and how they came up in their professions of design. And then we'll look at that exact same idea of how design students were educated and raised in their professions and disciplines in the context of pre-World War II, specifically, because that's where our film series starts, is right before World War II broke out. And so you'll see college students returning to school, design students coming to school, no idea that just a year or two away from a huge war that would forever impact their lives. We'll see what it was like in their school and how the government and the social, just like environmental forces, there's social forces, there's religious forces, there's economic forces that came into play. So we'll see how all of those things shape them as designers, because that's affecting you current day as well. And then you're going to make a reflection. You'll watch the first episode, which is when they come to school. And we first see the introduction of the Bauhaus philosophy to the existing overarching art school. And you'll write some reflections through homework. So come on Tuesday, we'll have like an hour of lecture and then an hour of film. There will be the popcorn machine. You can bring your computer if you want to write. I will have the questions ready for you. So while you're watching the film, you'll be able to, think and reflect. That's totally fine. Please, let's do furniture technique day. That would be awesome. Okay. That will involve some planning and acquiring of some things, but yeah, that sounds cool. Maybe I'll bring in a guest professional to come in and do something like that too. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to stop recording.